皆様、おはようございます。どうぞよろしくお願いします。クリスチャーネ・アクネ・サトと申します。私、サンパウロから、ブラジルのサンパウロ市からよろしくお願いします。I'm sorry, please allow me to speak in English on this presentation. Are you hearing me well? Is it okay?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
So now I'm trying to share your slide. I think this one. Okay. I share the screen. Okay.
So let's begin, please. Okay. Well, 皆様、these are my data. My name is Christianne Akune Sato. I was born on August 20th, 1965. I was born in São Paulo, Brazil, and my occupation is attorney at law. I'm a lawyer. I am currently living in São Paulo, Brazil, and I am Nikkei Sansei. It means that I'm a Japanese immigrant's granddaughter. And my grandparents were, well, on the side from my father, my grandfather, his name was Eiji Akune. He was born in Kagoshima, and he arrived in Brazil in 1916. And my grandmother, her name was Matsue Akune. She was born in Kumamoto Prefecture and arrived in Brazil in 1926. Next, please. My mother's parents were Yukio Goto. My grandfather's name was Yukio Goto. He was born in Tokyo and he arrived in Brazil in 1934. And my grandmother, her name was Fujino Nishikubo Goto. She was born in Fukushima Prefecture, but I don't know exactly when she came to Brazil. And my grandfather, Yukio Goto, he was a great Kanto earthquake survivor. And his family lost everything during the Great Kanto earthquake, and they didn't quite still recover when the Great Depression in 1930s came. Their life in Japan then became too difficult, and his entire family decided to emigrate to Brazil. And Brazil is a country built by immigrants from all over the world, just like the US. Although my parents were born in Brazil and they were Brazilian citizens, during World War II, they were discriminated and mocked on the streets by other children. During World War II, Japanese language was banned in Brazil, and my parents and their siblings did not learn Japanese. So, where is São Paulo? São Paulo is on the other side of the world, considering from the Japanese point of view. So there is no further place from Japan than Brazil. However, Brazil has the largest Japanese descendants community overseas. It's estimated nowadays around 2 million people. And most of them live in São Paulo and are fully integrated to Brazilian society. But integration for most of us came at the price of losing or distancing ourselves from our Japanese roots. Sensei, please. Next. Well, how does São Paulo look like? It's like that. It's a very big city, and in my family, my parents' generation avoided contact with Japanese communities and tried to become most westernized as possible. They spoke only Portuguese, ate only Brazilian food, and except for my parents, all my uncles and aunts dated or got married to Western features Brazilians. And when I was born, my grandparents gave me a Japanese name. I was supposed to be named Chiemi, but my parents did not register it. And when I was a toddler, my mother tied up my legs to keep them straight to prevent me from developing the typical Japanese arched legs. And after my brother was born, my family moved to a 40 apartments building where we were the only Japanese descendant family. Almost all dwellers were immigrants from many different countries. From, for example, Italy, Spain, Germany, Poland, Lebanon, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and India. So the building's Brazilian keeper called it Babel Tower Condominium. Half of all dwellers were Jewish from different parts of the world, and many came to Brazil escaping from Nazi persecution in Europe. Dona Nani, and this is an affectionate short name of Mrs. Erna von Lösche. She was a German Jewish lady who lived on the 8th floor, and she offered herself to teach German to the building's kids. And as my parents encouraged learning Western foreign languages, I started attending German classes at Dona Nani's apartment when I was 8 years old. Next, please. So, how was my lifestyle then? Well, for example, this on the left photo, you can see my childhood best friends. They were siblings. Their names were Katia Rubin and Juliana. They were my neighbors and friends, and we literally grew up together. And with them, I understood that even without speaking Hebrew or Yiddish, or even without a homeland of their own, the Jewish people kept their identity for centuries, transmitting their history to religion. And this is a life experience. And for example, Mrs. Ilse Wasserberger, she lived on 10th floor. She was a Polish Jewish teen nurse during World War II. And she met her husband, Mr. Max. He was a German soldier, 19 years older, 19 years her senior when they met during the World War. And they came to Brazil and they got married. This is one of the most amazing love story I've ever known. And she was a very kind old lady, and sharing life stories with many different origins people was the best aspect of growing up in that building. Next, please. So, which were my earliest Japanese influences when growing up in a big city and away from a Japanese community? It was by television. In the late 1960s, there were several anime series being broadcasted in Brazilian TV. And it was very different from the American cartoons we used to watch that time. And among these Japanese anime, there were these series, and they became quite, how can I say, they were quite different, and it was important for many of Japanese descendants to watch them on TV. And please, next one. The one I enjoyed the most was a series here in Brazil called Super Dynamo. As I remember in Japanese, the name was Paman. And it was a very funny show because it showed a Japanese humor, a Japanese styled humor. And in the series, we could watch many Japanese lifestyle references. And for example, the need of taking shoes off before entering home, things that really called my attention, for example, is that the characters of this show were still in Japanese. And for example, I remember the main character was named Mitsuo, and his bedroom did not have a bed. So these small things began striking me the knowledge that Japan was a different, far away country, but yet it was still looking strangely familiar. So by watching Super Dynamo, I began realizing differences between Brazilian lifestyle and Japanese lifestyle. For example, next, please. This one is interesting because the first time I saw a Japanese melon was on that anime series, because Brazilian melon was completely different of the melon, the fruit they showed on Paman. Next, please. And another difference was when Mitsuo's mother called him for him to eat an afternoon snack. For example, in Japan, I realized that children ate yaki-imo and onigiri, while my child time afternoon snack used to be this brewed coffee with milk. We call it café com leite and pão com manteiga, or it would be also an avocado milkshake. We call this vitamina de abacate. So it was a child's cultural shock to watch Parman and our reality here in Brazil. Next, please. So when I was a kid, in addition to anime on TV, there were several Japanese movie theaters in São Paulo's Liberdade district, which my grandfather Yukio Goto was very fond of. All Japanese movie theaters unfortunately closed in the 1980s, but I remember that during school holidays and on Saturdays and Sundays in the morning, Cine Niterói, which is the one shown on the left photo, Cine Niterói used to show Toei, Japan's Toei's full-length anime features, and grandfather took me to the movies as much as he could. And thanks to him, I at least grew up hearing Japanese spoken in movies and appreciating Japanese anime. Remember, when Brazil forbade teaching and speaking Japanese during World War I, these at about 5 years, when foreign languages were forbidden in Brazil, it broke for many families the use and the, how can I say, Japanese spoken turned very rare. We very seldom used to hear Japanese spoken on streets. So it was very important to watch Japanese movies just to hear Japanese spoken again. Next, please. And I was about 8 years old when I found at my grandfather's house those Margareto Mangazashi. And grandfather bought these magazines hoping that his daughters would enjoy them and learn Japanese. So, well, it didn't work with my mother and my aunts, but I liked manga so much that my grandfather taught me katakana and hiragana using these magazines. After movies, grandfather used to take me to Japanese bookshops and kashihonya in Liberdade district. In the 1970s, there were 9 shops, 9 bookshops in Liberdade district. And nowadays only 2 remained. And one of them, thanks God, is Livraria Sol Taiodo. Please, next. So when I was a teen, I could speak German and English. And my parents were quite happy with my performance at school. But they were not as supportive about me learning Japanese. And that's why I did not formally study Japanese. For many years, manga was my only source of Japanese language and culture. At the age of 10, I wore my first yukata. These yukata were made by Akune grandmother. With Tamono, her recently found sister sent from Japan. My grandmother and her sisters were kept apart for 45 years because of World War II. And really, this moment sparkled in me a passion for kimono. I still enjoy very much wearing kimono. Next, please. So in 1987, I've got a scholarship program in Japan, and this really changed my whole life because it allowed me to witness how it was Japan during economic bubble times. And I could meet for the first time Akune grandmother's sister's family. I was the first family member to go to Japan in 55 years then. Next, please. And my contact with São Paulo's Japanese community began in 1984. In 1984, a journalist named Francisco Noriyuki Sato and Professor Sonia Luiten from University of São Paulo and a group of young designers founded Abrademi. This is the Brazilian Manga Association. This Manga Association was the first seinen I joined. And from then on, I joined many other Japanese community associations here in São Paulo. Well, the knowledge of several foreign languages, manga, and some Japanese culture eventually opened up for me opportunities to work on manga translation and adaptation projects, and even to write articles for magazines and newspapers here in São Paulo. In 2007, I wrote a book named Jap-Pop. It's a book on Japanese culture, pop culture, phenomena, and icons. And now it's considered a reference book on Japanese culture in Brazil. Next, please. And one of these projects was the Brazilian edition of Takahashi Rumiko's manga, Ranma Nibunoichi. The Brazilian edition had in each issue half a page explaining aspects of Japanese culture to young readers. And it helped, for example, to popularize Japanese-style ramen in Brazil and other aspects, like kotatsu, for example. And this panel is at the Kobe Center for Overseas Migration and Cultural Interaction. It shows Ranma Nibunoichi, a publishing team in Brazil. It was me, Japanese editor Nagata Tasuku-san, and Brazilian cartoonists Valberto and Jao. This photo was taken by my husband in 2016. Surprised to find my image on a panel while visiting a museum in Japan. And when he told me that, I was also very surprised. I feel honored by that, really. And we didn't know it was there. It's really surprising that they chose this old photograph to put in their exhibition. And next, please. Well, through the years, I began to volunteer in many Japanese associations here in São Paulo. And for example, I recently have been working for the Study in Japan project at Festival do Japão. It's a very big Japanese culture event in São Paulo. And I also gave lectures and organized meetings about Japanese garments and aesthetics for the Brazilian J Fashion Association. Here you can see, for example, some of these meetings in Liberdade district, and also the lectures we were organizing before the pandemics. Next, please. I have to mention with extreme gratitude to JICA, which is a short name for Japan International Cooperation Agency. JICA has been very important in creating Japanese culture and technology learning opportunities for descendants all over the world. So the Nikkei Identity Training Program in Kanazawa University allowed me to deepen my knowledge of Japan ethics, aesthetics, and history. I attended the 2016 Nikkei Identity Program, and it had such an impact on me that it inspired me to create a Japanese history course in Portuguese for Brazilians. Next, please. So, starting in 2017, with the support of Abrademi, we created the first Japanese history course in Portuguese for Brazilians. And during 4 years, over 500 people attended the classes here in São Paulo. And currently, due to the coronavirus pandemic, we are doing an online version of the course. I suddenly realized that although many efforts to preserve the Japanese identity here in Brazil, there was for many of we descendants a lack of knowledge of how the Japanese civilization developed through the thousands of years. And we suddenly realized that somehow explaining that history would bring a feeling of that all Japanese descendants are somehow part of that historical development. As much as it happens to the Jewish community, it was important to explain the Japanese civilization history for all those who somehow have a link, have a past linked to Japan. Next, please. So this is the end of my presentation. 皆様、どうもありがとうございました。Oh, will you show this photo, Sensei?
Yes, it's possible. Could you explain
Okay.
the photo?
Okay. Okay. This is my official school photo when I was during my 4th grade. So these are my 4th grade classmates when I was 10 years old. You can see by this time here in São Paulo that, well, several years ago, if we could see, for example, my husband's classmates' photo, 1/3 of the classroom were Japanese Brazilian kids. And when it comes to my generation, each classroom had very few Japanese Brazilian kids. For example, here, only 2, me and the boy, we were Brazilian Japanese descendants. But the other girl, the other Asian girl, it's interesting because she was a Taiwanese immigrant girl.
Okay. And this one?
Oh, this one. Okay. That photo is my first communion ceremony. My parents didn't follow any religion, but as a Catholic certificate of christening was required as a mandatory entry document by many schools in Brazil, my parents had me christened when I was a baby. And at 8 years old, Christian children, Catholic Christian children, they have to do the first communion ceremony. And this is the moment we were entering the church. Jewish and Protestant children, they had to go to another classroom during religion class at school. By the way, I studied in public schools my whole life. And for example, Buddhist or Shintoist children, Brazilian Japanese children, they used to follow the family tradition. Most of them were Buddhist or Shintoist or even both. But for Eastern religions, children had no options. So we all had to be declared as Catholic children.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.